It takes an experienced surgeon 3 hours of scalpel work to completely remove skin and muscle from a human skull. At the foot of the Great Sphinx, in July of 1799, something did this to 12 soldiers in less than a minute. They stood in a battle square, clutching loaded muskets, but they had no faces. Their heads were perfectly polished bone, as if they had been licked by a giant tongue covered in diamond dust. Not a drop of blood on the snow-white collars. Not a single shot. Napoleon personally ordered the bodies to be burned and the cause of death to be recorded as acute desert fever. But fever does not break hardened steel bayonets in half or leave dents in the sand like marks from a hydraulic press. The truth was cleared up. It only surfaced 200 years later when, in the basement of an abandoned abbey in northern France, while sorting through the storerooms of an old monastery, a leather-field notebook was found, which, even through the salt, reeked of rancid fat and animal horror. On the inside cover was written the name of an engineering officer who had taken part in the Egyptian campaign. The ink had smudged in some places, as if water or blood had dripped onto it. The notebook was among church papers that were not supposed to end up in the monastery. The handwriting and paper confirmed the authenticity of the notes, but the church refused to explain how the document came to be in its vault. The diary's author was a rational and educated man. He was responsible for surveying ancient structures and fortifying French camps near the ruins. His signature was present in the official reports of the expedition, which confirmed his existence. Army records list him as having died of fever a month after arriving in Egypt. However, the notebook told a story that was not in the official version. The lines led to nights when people disappeared from the pyramids and the sand moved without wind. The first entry began with a description of horror that defied military protocol. The officer wrote of 2 helmets found in the desert, both filled with congealed blood. There were scratches on the inside of the metal, as if someone had tried to get out. The diary contained no direct speech, only the cold observations of a man trying to maintain his sanity. He noted that the soldiers' bodies were not found, and their guns lay in the sand without signs of a struggle. Next came lines about the order to explore the recently discovered tomb near the plateau. The officer indicated the date of the order and the names of those who were to participate in the excavation. He wrote that he insisted on fortifying the entrance and the presence of an armed guard. His tone remained dry, but fear oozed between his words. He noted that the Egyptian workers refused to enter despite the payment, and their eyes expressed a knowledge that had no translation. The next page was stained with darker blood. The officer recorded that not only sarcophagi, but also bones that did not resemble human ones were found inside the tomb. He described a skull with an elongated muzzle and powerful jaws, in which the fangs were longer than human fingers. The expedition's scientists dismissed the discovery as a freak of nature. But by evening, 2 soldiers had disappeared near the entrance, leaving claw marks in the sand. The author didn't use words about curses. He tried to find a rational explanation, like an engineer. He wrote that the predator could hide underground, using ancient tunnels. He hypothesized the existence of an unknown desert animal that could survive without water. These thoughts were an attempt to cling to science, while people around me disappeared. After a few pages, the handwriting became uneven, as if my hand was shaking. The officer noted a musky, decomposing odor emanating from the tomb. This odor clung to clothing and hair, causing nausea. The soldiers stopped eating and slept with loaded guns. Horses broke free from their tethers and destroyed their stalls without cause. The notebook contained a diagram of the tomb, with its chambers and passages marked. In the center was a hall with stone sculptures of dog-headed creatures. The author emphasized that the statues' eyes were hollow, as if they had been torn out. He added that one soldier claimed to have seen movement in these empty sockets. The officer then recorded the order to open the main sarcophagus. He noted the presence of 10 guards and 2 scientists. They lifted the lid with crowbars and ropes. There was no human body inside. Instead, they found the dried bones of an unknown creature and the remains of dark fur. After this, the recording was interrupted by spots that looked like blood. The next paragraph reported that during the night, the camp heard a howl that was neither wolf nor dog. It was low and pounding like a drumbeat. The soldiers rushed out of their tents, but the desert remained motionless. The officer noted that the guard at the tomb had not responded to the inspection. The next morning, all that was found at the entrance were their weapons and strips of leather from their belts. The sand around them was packed with enormous footprints, resembling the paws of an animal. He measured one footprint and recorded that it was wider than a human head. In the last lines of this part of the diary, the officer made a conclusion that could not appear in the official reports. He wrote that in the depths of the tomb there was not a burial place, but the lair of an ancient predator. He claimed that the creature used underground passages as burrows. He did not call it a god or a spirit, but described it as flesh and bone covered with hair. He then noted that command had ordered the work to continue despite the losses, and added that if the records were found, the reader should know that the first casualties were only the beginning. The detachment moved towards the tomb at dawn, when the sand still retained the night's chill, and the sky above the plateau was pale, like faded fabric. The French soldiers marched in heavy uniforms, with flintlocks on their belts and sabres hitting their thighs with every step. Their shoes sank into the loose sand, and their water bottles seemed lighter than the fear that trailed behind them like an invisible shadow. The officer whose notebook would later be found walked ahead, carrying measuring instruments and rolled-up maps, as if the usual work could shield the mind from what lay ahead. The two scientists carried the boxes of finds, and their fingers trembled more than the pride of enlightened people allowed. As the squad approached the entrance, the air changed. The wind died down, and even the rare desert birds disappeared from the sky, as if they did not want to watch what was happening. The horses left at the camp stamped their hooves and pulled at their reins, as if they sensed a threat that the people were still trying to deny. The Egyptian workers accompanying the expedition stopped a few dozen steps away and refused to go further. Their bodies froze and their lips whispered prayers to ancient gods whose names the French did not know. The officer noted in his diary that crossing the last stretch of the route felt like crossing an invisible line. Beyond it, the desert became too quiet, and the sunlight seemed dim, as if passing through cloudy glass. The sand beneath their feet was strangely dense, as if it had been compacted by heavy bodies. Every step echoed with a dull thud, like a blow to an empty coffin. Before entering the tomb, the soldiers paused to check their weapons. Flint cracked, gunpowder poured into the pans, and ramrods clanged against the barrels. These familiar sounds should have been soothing, but in this silence they seemed alien. The officer recorded that not a single person uttered an unnecessary word. Their faces were pale, their eyes glistening with sweat. As the first group entered the passage, the light from the kerosene lamps elongated the shadows on the walls. The stone was cold and damp, as if the tomb were breathing. On the walls were images of creatures with the bodies of people and the heads of dogs, and their elongated muzzles looked straight into the eyes of the living. The scientists tried to copy the hieroglyphs, but their hands were shaking and the lines were crooked. The smell appeared suddenly. It didn't resemble the smell of rotting bodies. It was a mixture of animal musk, old bones, and a sweet, viscous stench like heated blood. The soldiers winced and covered their faces with their sleeves, but the smell penetrated deeper, causing dizziness. The officer noted that after his first breath, his mouth was dry and his heart was beating faster than it had during battle. The passage led downward, and the steps were worn away by time. In some places, the stone bore deep scratches, as if claws had repeatedly raked it. The scientists stopped to examine these traces, but the officer hurried them, afraid to linger in the narrow corridor. He wrote that the walls seemed to be approaching, and the lamps gave too weak a light to dispel the darkness ahead. At one of the sites, the team discovered a niche containing bones. They did not resemble human bones. Long, curved ribs, thick vertebrae, and a skull with an elongated snout lay in the dust. The fangs in the jaw were long and sharp, and they retained dark stains. One of the soldiers tried to touch the bone, but pulled his hand back as if burned. The officer noted that even the dead remains conveyed a sense of danger. The passage widened further and the squad emerged into the hall. In the center stood a massive sarcophagus made of dark stone, covered with drawings of dog-headed creatures. Their paws held spears and their mouths were open, revealing fangs. Dark holes loomed in the eye sockets of these images, as if the stone had been deliberately hollowed out. The officer noted that, in this hall, the sound of footsteps faded too quickly, as if the air itself were absorbing them. Soldiers posted guards at the entrance and along the walls. The scientists approached the sarcophagus, running their fingers over the hieroglyphs. They tried to understand the meaning of the inscriptions, but the symbols seemed erased and deliberately damaged. The officer noted that not a single sign contained the pharaoh's name, which was odd for a royal tomb. Time passed slowly. The lamps crackled, but their light didn't reach the corners of the room. At one point, one of the soldiers near the wall twitched, as if he felt a touch. He turned around, but behind him there was only a flat surface of stone. His breathing became heavy and he asked to be relieved, but the officer refused, considering fear unacceptable. After a while, one of the guards disappeared. His place by the wall was empty and his gun was lying on the floor. The officer didn't notice it right away, and only after counting the people did he realize one person was missing. A search of the hall yielded nothing. There were no signs of a struggle, blood, or screams. The man had vanished, as if erased. The soldiers began exchanging glances, their confidence crumbling. Some crossed themselves. Others clutched their guns so tightly that their fingers turned white. The officer noted in his notebook that discipline was creaking like an old board under heavy footsteps. But he continued to issue orders, hoping to maintain order. After a while, another soldier disappeared. His lamp remained on the floor, its wick still burning. The officer recorded that this happened without a sound. People began to retreat closer to the exit, but the officer stopped them, fearing panic. He wrote that at that moment he realized there was someone else in the tomb, invisible and patient. The scent of musk intensified. It became so thick that it seemed liquid. The soldiers coughed and some had watery eyes. The scientists stopped working and retreated, pressing their handkerchiefs to their faces. The officer noted that even the flames of the lamps flickered strangely, as if the air was moving from the breath of a huge creature. A dull sound, like a heavy body hitting stone, was heard from the depths of one of the corridors. It was repeated, slow and confident. The officer wrote that the sound could not have been made by a human. It resembled the tread of a creature whose mass exceeded that of a horse. The guards raised their rifles, pointing them down the dark passage. The lamps illuminated only the first few meters. Beyond that, the darkness remained thick and still. The soldiers waited for the order to fire, but the officer hesitated, trying to maintain control of the situation. He wrote that at that moment he realized that the tomb was not just a place for the dead, but the territory of a living predator. Soon, one of the scientists broke away and ran for the exit. His footsteps echoed down the corridor, but halfway there, the sound abruptly stopped. The officer noted that the scientist's lamp had gone out and the man had not returned. Panic gripped the others. The soldiers began to retreat, but something deep in the passage was moving faster than a man could run. The officer made one last entry before events spiraled out of control. He wrote that the party had entered the tomb as explorers of antiquity, but had now become prey to a creature that called these stone halls home. He noted that if anyone finds these lines, they should know that the real danger has not yet fully revealed itself, but has already begun the hunt. Time ceased to feel normal. Inside the tomb, minutes dragged on like hours, and the sound of people's breathing was louder than gunshots. The officer recorded that after the scientist's disappearance, no one dared to look into the dark passages for more than one breath. The soldiers held their guns at the ready, but their fingers were shaking, and the flints could fall off at any moment. The lamps smoked, their light turning yellow and sickly, as if the lights themselves were tired of fighting the darkness. The smell of musk and decay was now so thick that it seemed tangible, like a wet cloth covering their faces. The first blow came without warning. Something burst out of the side corridor, faster than a human eye could see. The officer only managed to see a blurry shadow, and the glint of eyes reflecting the lamplight. The soldier by the wall didn't have time to scream. There was a short, wet crunch, as if fresh bones were being broken, and the body disappeared into the darkness. All that remained on the stone floor was the saber, which clanged once and then fell silent. The blood spread slowly, like thick oil. The soldiers opened fire indiscriminately into the dark passage. Flintlocks thundered, and gunpowder smoke filled the hall, mingling with the stench of the tomb. The bullets hit the stone, striking sparks, but not a single shot stopped what was hidden behind the smoke. The officer noted that the creature did not roar or breathe until it killed. It moved in the pauses between the sounds, as if it were mastering the silence itself. Another soldier had disappeared. This time, people saw him being dragged away. A huge limb covered in coarse fur and taut muscles emerged from the smoke. Its claws were curved and dark as obsidian. They sank into the man's chest, piercing the fabric of his uniform and his ribs in one motion. The body jerked, the air left the lungs, and the soldier disappeared into the side corridor, leaving behind drops of blood falling onto the stone with an even rhythm. Panic instantly spread. The guards rushed to the exit, but the officer tried to hold them back, realizing that the people in the narrow passages would be easy prey. He shouted orders, but his voice was drowned out by gunshots and screams. Lamps fell to the floor, their glass shattering, and the flames went out. Darkness engulfed the hall, leaving only the dim, reddish glow of the one remaining lamp. In this light, the officer saw himself fully for the first time. The creature emerged from the corridor slowly, confidently, as if it was in no hurry to find its prey because it knew there was no way out. He stood 2 heads taller than a human. His body was covered in coarse, dark fur, matted and dirty, as if soaked in the blood and dust of centuries. The muscles beneath the fur moved like ropes stretched taut across a stone statue. The chest rose slowly, accompanied by the heavy, wet sound of breathing. The creature's head resembled that of a dog, but one deformed by nature. The muzzle was elongated, the skull bones powerful and broad. The mouth opened wider than any beast's, and inside were visible several rows of teeth, thin and sharp as fish needles, but strong as steel. Thick, dark saliva flowed between them, falling onto the stone with occasional drops. The eyes had no pupils. They were a dull yellow, as if covered with a thin film, and reflected the lamplight with a dead shine. The officer noted that the creature smelled of old musk, rot, and hot blood. The odor was so strong that it made people's eyes blur. Some soldiers fell to their knees, clutching their mouths. Others tried to retreat, never taking their eyes off the predator. But the beast didn't pounce immediately. He studied, tilting his head like a dog listening for footsteps. Only his breathing remained slow and heavy, confident. The first daredevil fired straight at the creature's chest. The bullet struck flesh and the fur parted, revealing a dark, wet wound. But instead of stopping, the predator only twitched as if it had been stung. The blood was thick and almost black, slowly trickling down the muscles, but the creature showed no pain. It took a step forward, then another. The stone floor trembled under his weight. The soldiers fired one after another. The bullets entered the body but stuck in the dense fat and muscle. None penetrated deeply. The officer recorded that weapons intended for people and horses were useless against this flesh. The sabers gleamed in the soldiers' hands, but the blades only slid across the skin, leaving shallow cuts. The creature responded to each blow with a twist of its head and a quick swipe of its paw. One soldier lunged forward with a saber, attempting to strike it in the neck. He managed to take a step. A huge paw struck him from above. The bones of his shoulder shattered like dry branches. The body fell, still alive, but already helpless. The predator grabbed his head in its jaws. There was a brief crack and the man stopped moving. Blood trickled down the stone, mixing with the dust of centuries. The officer retreated to the wall, continuing to write short phrases in his notebook with a trembling hand. He noted every detail, as if hoping the knowledge would save those who read it later. He wrote that the creature was not a spirit or a deity. It was a living organism, ancient, adapted to darkness and stone. Its muscles were built for jumping in narrow passages. Its bones were as strong as metal, and its teeth were designed to crush armor and bone. The soldiers tried to retreat toward the exit, but the corridors were narrow and people were getting in each other's way. More screams were heard in the darkness. The officer realized there were others in the passages, even more of the same predators. He wrote that the howls now came from all directions, bouncing off the walls, creating the illusion of an endless lair. These weren't solitary animals, they were a pack. The lamp in the hall began to fade. The flame flickered, stretched into a thin line, and finally died out. Darkness fell. All that could be heard were heavy steps, the breathing of animals, and short human cries that ended too quickly. The officer lost his sight, but continued to write by touch, scratching the paper with his pen. He noted that their unit had been destroyed not instantly, but methodically. The predators moved without fuss, choosing victim after victim. Not a single person could run far enough. Not a single one could close the door behind them. The stone corridors were a trap, built long before their arrival. The last lines of this entry were written almost at random, the letters overlapping each other. The officer wrote that he had realized the tomb's true purpose. It wasn't a burial site, but a cage, and they opened it themselves. He added that the ancient builders didn't worship dog-headed creatures. They tried to keep them underground. At that moment, sharp lines appeared in the notebook, as if someone had jerked their hand. The ink spilled, leaving a wide stain. Then followed one short phrase, almost unreadable but discernible. He wrote that he could hear breathing behind him. The recording ended. The officer didn't know how long he lay in the darkness, pressed against the cold wall, with the notebook under his chest, as if it could protect him from claws. When he began to write again, his handwriting became small and ragged, as if each letter was written through pain. He noted that he came to consciousness in a silence too deep to be safe. The air in the tomb grew thicker, thick with the scent of blood, fur, and entrails. The stone floor was warm, as if a huge body were breathing beneath it. He wrote that he tried to get up but felt a sharp pain in his leg. A piece of stone or bone was lodged in his hip. He bandaged the wound with the strap from his uniform backpack, tightening it until it went numb. He didn't shout because he knew that any sound could attract the attention of those who still remained in the corridors. He noted that fragments of his soldiers' bodies lay around. Torn uniforms, fragments of weapons, broken bayonets. Not a single intact body, only what was of no value to the predators. The officer crawled toward a side passage he had noticed before the attack. He moved slowly, leaving a trail of blood behind him. He wrote that the stone felt sticky under his palms. He didn't want to understand what exactly covered the surface. The lamps had long since gone out, but a faint light shone from the depths, strange, greenish, as if coming from mushrooms or lichens growing on the walls. This light was enough to make out outlines. He noted that in one of the corridors he found an old grate made of darkened metal. It was bent, as if someone had tried to break it from the inside. The officer wrote that the ancient builders didn't trust the stone. They blocked off what lay deeper with several barriers. He squeezed through the narrow gap between the bars and the wall, tearing his uniform and skin. Behind the bars was a smaller chamber. It contained no sarcophagi or statues, only an empty stone hall and a niche where a lamp or vessel had once stood. The officer realized this was not a sacred space. It was a shelter, a place where the people who served these tombs might have hidden. He climbed into the niche, pushing the fragment of stone behind him as far as his strength allowed. He wrote that he sat in this niche, motionless. His breathing was shallow. Blood trickled down his leg and soaked into the fabric of his trousers. He didn't know how much time had passed. Minutes and hours lost their meaning. He only listened. First came the footsteps, heavy, confident. They echoed down the main corridor. The stone vibrated with every step. Then the sound of bodies dragging. The predators dragged their prey into the depths where he couldn't see. Then came the wet sounds of tearing flesh. Bones broke with a dry crack. These sounds weren't fast. They were methodical, calm, like a butcher's work. The officer wrote that in those moments, he realized the tomb wasn't an ancient temple. It was a food storage facility. The people who came here became food for creatures that had been sleeping for centuries. The expedition awakened them. The officer didn't write about curses. He wrote about biology. He noted that if these creatures could survive without food for hundreds of years, their metabolism was slow, but after awakening, they required a lot of meat. After a while, the sounds died down. Silence reigned, in which only the officer's breathing and the occasional drip of liquid from the ceiling could be heard. He wrote that he was afraid to even blink. He held the notebook open on his lap and wrote by touch, unable to see the letters. He wrote down his realization that no one from the squad had survived. He was the only one left in the lair. Later, he noted a new movement. It was different. Not heavy footsteps, but scraping sounds. Claws dragged across the stone, as if the creatures were sniffing the walls, searching for anything that had survived. Then came the sound of breathing. It was close. Warm air touched his face. The smell was so strong that tears flowed from his eyes. He couldn't close his mouth for fear of making a sound. The officer wrote that he realized the animal was searching for him. He could smell him, smell his blood, smell his fear. He noted that a person cannot hide from a creature for which darkness is a natural environment. He continued writing because it was the only thing that kept him from going mad. He wrote that if the notebook is found, the reader should know that the predators are not myths or gods. They are flesh and blood, and they live beneath the sands of Egypt. The following lines became shorter. The ink faltered, as if the pen was sliding across dry paper. He noticed he could hear the creature approaching his niche, its claws brushing against the stone nearby. The stone he'd been using to cover the entrance shifted a fraction of a finger's breadth. A streak of greenish light filtered in. A fragment of a muzzle appeared in that streak, fur matted with blood, teeth gleaming wetly, eyes without pupils. The officer wrote that the creature stopped. It sniffed the air. He felt hot breath on his cheek. He couldn't move. His hand was shaking, but he continued writing. He wrote that he knew he wouldn't leave here. He wrote that he was warning everyone who read these lines. Don't open the tombs. Don't disturb the depths. Because the ancient builders didn't bury their gods here. They locked away predators. The last lines of the notebook were written with force, as if the author knew that this was his only chance to tell the truth. He wrote that the stone at the entrance was moving, that claws were already entering the opening, that the darkness behind him had become warmer. He began to write another sentence, but the letters broke off. The ink flowed in a long line, as if his hand had been jerked downwards. This is where the recording ends. The French camp at the plateau greeted the dawn, unaware that not a single person from the first detachment remained alive underground. The sun rose over the sands, painting the pyramids a reddish hue, and this light seemed normal, calm, almost peaceful. But in the tents, the soldiers awoke from troubled dreams. Horses stamped the ground, dogs refused to eat. The air above the camp carried a faint smell, like rot, but no one could determine its source. The sentries at the foot of the plateau complained that they had heard underground sounds all night, dull blows, as if huge hammers were working in the depths of the desert. When the time came for the team to leave the tomb, no one appeared. This didn't cause immediate alarm at first. Scientists often found themselves delayed in their excavations. The officers assumed the survey was proving more difficult than expected. However, after 2 hours, the lack of personnel became an obvious problem. The senior officers gathered in the command tent. It was decided to send a new platoon for inspection. The soldiers of the second detachment advanced confidently. Their guns were clean, their powder dry, their bayonets gleaming in the morning light. They were unaware that their comrades below had already become part of the underground lair. They were ordered not to linger in the passages and to escort the scientists and engineering officer outside. The Egyptian guides refused. They knelt at the foot of the plateau, covered their faces with cloth and muttered prayers. The French soldiers dismissed this as a manifestation of a savage fear of the ancient gods and paid no attention. The detachment entered the tomb. First, they were greeted by the coolness of the stone, then the smell. It hit my nose suddenly, thick and heavy, a mixture of old blood, animal musk, and something sweet, reminiscent of entrails. Some soldiers covered their faces with their sleeves, but the smell persisted. Torches lit the passages, and strange, dark streaks appeared on the walls. Abandoned lamps lay scattered on the floor, molten metal dripping in frozen drops. A few steps later, they found their first weapon. The gun lay on a stone, the ramrod extended, the shelf open, as if the man was about to shoot and did not have time. A bayonet lay nearby, bent at an impossible angle. Beyond it stretched a trail of dark stains. The soldiers knew it was blood, but they couldn't see the bodies. Not a single one. Only traces of what remained of them. When they reached the main hall, the torches illuminated a terrifying scene. The stone floor was covered with bones. Some still had scraps of uniforms. Skulls were crushed. Ribs were broken. The walls were covered in scratches, deep and wide, left by claws. The sarcophagus stood open, its lid lying on its side. Inside there was nothing but emptiness. Stone statues of dog-headed creatures stared with empty eye sockets straight at the people. The second squad's commander ordered them to maintain formation. The soldiers moved slowly forward, checking every corridor. They called out to the missing, but their voices were muffled by the stone. There was no answer, only the occasional drip of liquid from the ceiling and a strange echo that made steps sound heavier than they actually were. In one of the side passages, they found the torn uniform of an engineering officer. The fabric was torn as if it had been torn not by a knife, but by claws. A notebook lay on a nearby stone, but it wasn't immediately noticed. The torch illuminated only the corner of the binding, stained with dark paper. The soldiers didn't know that this notebook would later change their understanding of the events of that night. One of the soldiers walking ahead suddenly disappeared around a bend. His steps stopped abruptly. Then came a sound like a heavy sack hitting a stone, then a wet crunch. The others rushed forward, but the corridor ahead was empty. Only a helmet lay on the floor, slowly rolling down the sloping stone. Panic began to spread. The commander tried to hold his men back. He realized that in the narrow corridors, a retreat would become a disorderly rout. He ordered the torches held high and the men to march in close formation. But the musky scent grew stronger. The air grew heavy. The torch flames flickered without a wind. Breathing came from the darkness, deep, slow, wet. It was closer than it should have been. One of the soldiers raised his rifle and fired. A roar echoed down the corridor. Gunpowder smoke filled the space for a moment. When it cleared, a creature emerged from the shadows. It was taller than a man. Its body was covered in coarse, dark fur. The muscles beneath it moved like taut ropes. Its mouth opened, revealing several rows of sharp teeth. Thick drool dripped from her. Her eyes had no pupils. They reflected the torchlight with a dull, yellow glow. The smell was unbearable. The soldiers felt their legs buckle. The commander ordered them to fire. The guns roared. The bullets struck the creature's body, tearing its fur, opening dark wounds. But the beast didn't fall. It only twitched, as if bitten by insects. Then he took a step forward. Another. The stone beneath his paws trembled. One soldier tried to stab him with his bayonet. The blade penetrated the flesh, but not deeply. The creature turned its head. A paw struck the man in the chest. Bones cracked. The soldier flew back, hit the wall, and slid to the floor. His breathing stopped after a few seconds. The others began to retreat, but the corridor was narrow. People jostled, dropping torches. Darkness devoured the formation. More footsteps came from the side passages. More breathing, more claws. It wasn't just one creature, it was a pack. The soldiers ran for the exit. Some fell. Some lost their guns. Some tried to shoot backwards without aiming. Screams echoed off the walls, turning into a chaotic noise. One man was dragged away so quickly that the others didn't even see who did it. Only a scream, cut off in an instant. A few soldiers finally broke through. They ran into the light, blinded by the sun. Their faces were as white as the limestone of the pyramids. They tried to speak, but only incoherent words came out. Command listened to their rambling stories. At first, the officers tried to find a rational explanation. Perhaps a wild animal attack, perhaps gas from the depths. But when the remaining platoon confirmed the deaths of almost all their men, the explanations ended. The order was given to seal the tomb. The workers were forced to drag the stone blocks to the entrance. The soldiers secured them with metal clamps. Then they poured a thick layer of sand on top. No one went down to check. No one took the bodies. No one looked for the missing. Everything behind the slabs was considered lost. Official reports described an excavation accident and the sudden collapse of ancient tunnels, about the death of a detachment in the line of duty. Their names were added to the lists of the dead. Their personal belongings were divided. Their memory was honored formally. No one mentioned the creatures of the deep. No one wrote about the dog-headed predators. The papers accepted the convenient lie. But the soldiers who survived the retreat couldn't forget what they'd seen. One of them cried out at night that he could hear breathing behind him. He was sent to a mental hospital. Another became an alcoholic, repeating that the hounds of the pharaohs lived under the sand. The third disappeared into the desert, trying to return to the plateau as if drawn back. The camp was soon moved further. The expedition continued on its way. Scientists wrote papers, engineers drew plans, officers received awards. The Egyptian campaign went down in history as a feat of intellect and arms. But the area near the plateau where the tomb was located was tacitly closed to further work. New teams were told the ground there was unstable. The Egyptian workers knew the real reason, but they remained silent. Silence reigned underground once again. The predators had had their fill. Their breathing slowed. Their bodies disappeared into the deep chambers. They could wait a long time. They were undisturbed for centuries. They were part of the desert, like sand and stone, until a man comes again with a torch and a crowbar. And above, the wind smoothed the tracks near the sealed entrance. Sand hid the place where the soldiers had disappeared. The sun shone equally for the living and the dead. And only sometimes, on the hottest days, a slight tremor would appear over this patch of air, as if something huge underground were turning over in its sleep. The accompanying papers to the report on the sealed tomb contained a strange detail that was later noticed only by attentive archivists. The list of materials used included lead, although lead was not required to secure the stone slabs. The instruction was repeated twice, as if someone insisted that it remain on paper. The quartermaster's signature was next to it, but the ink was a different color from the rest of the text. It looked like an insertion made later, after the report had already passed through the authorities. A few days after the entrance to the camp was sealed, individual sentries began to disappear. Not in entire squads, but one at a time, as if someone was testing the limits of what was permitted. There were no signs of a struggle. The rifles lay on the sand. Bayonets remained in their scabbards. Dark stains resembling tar sometimes appeared on the collars of their uniforms. These stains smelled of the same musk that the soldiers had smelled in the corridors of the tomb. Command chalked up the disappearances as desertion and fear of war. But letters home found later revealed a different story. They described the silence of the nights when the desert ceased to breathe. At the end of July, a small group of engineers was sent to the site of the sealed tomb. They had to check to see if the sand had settled and if the entrance had reopened. The people walked during the day under the harsh sun and therefore believed the danger had passed. Upon arrival, they found the sand surface smooth. The metal brackets weren't sticking out. But in one spot, the sand was slightly raised, as if a huge rock lay underneath. Engineers excavated the top layer and came across a lead plate placed on top of stone blocks. The plate was nailed to the stone with thick pins. There were scratches on it, roughly and hastily applied. They resembled a diagram but looked more like a warning. The group decided not to continue the excavation. The sand was refilled. The discovery was reported to command. That same evening, an order went out throughout the camp to prohibit approaching this area without the personal permission of a senior officer. The order didn't explain the reasons, which only increased the fear. The soldiers began to avoid the area. Even during the day, people could smell a faint, rotten smell there, even though there was no wind. Birds didn't perch on the nearby rocks. The insects disappeared, as if the air there was unsuitable for life. At the beginning of August, an official from headquarters, responsible for correspondence and accounting of losses, arrived at the camp. He requested all the papers related to the disappearances and sealings. He worked at night by lamplight and rarely left his tent. He was found dead in the morning. There were no wounds on his face. His eyes were still open. A crust of dark saliva smelling of musk had formed on his lips. The doctor attributed cardiac arrest to heat and fatigue. But those who carried the body noticed 4 sharp, deep marks on his neck. These marks resembled punctures made by long, thin teeth. After that, the papers began to disappear. Not the actual reports on the campaigns, but sheets that mentioned missing sentries, a lead plate, and a section of desert near the plateau. In the archive folders, there were still neatly cut out places, as if someone had worked with a knife. Only copies that accidentally ended up in the hands of the quartermaster survive. In the margins of these copies were visible the notes of the engineer officer, whose notebook would later become the main evidence. These notes were brief. They recorded the smell, the silence, the footsteps beneath the sand. They confirmed that the danger hadn't ended with the sealing. By the end of the month, the camp had been moved. The documents cited reasons related to water and supply. In reality, however, people refused to sleep near the plateau. The soldiers claimed to hear a howling sound at night that came not from above, but from the ground. It was low and drawn out. It wasn't carried by the wind, but seemed to rise up through the sand. Those standing guard felt the vibration in the soles of their feet. The horses reared. The fires burned steadily, but a deathly silence descended around them. The tomb itself remained buried beneath the sand. There were no markings on the surface, but the locals remembered the area. They knew they couldn't pitch tents there. They knew they couldn't dig wells there. They spoke of this without words, through gestures and silence. There was no theatrical superstition in their behavior. There was simple knowledge passed down as a rule of survival. Decades later, French archives received a box of papers labeled as materials from the Egyptian expedition. Inside were copies of reports, maps, statements, and an engineering officer's notebook. The box arrived unsigned. The cover sheet only contained instructions to keep the documents separate. The paper smelled of wax and smoke, as if it had been kept near candles in a closed room. There was sand on the edges of the pages, fine and yellow, as if they hadn't managed to shake it out. The notebook hadn't been read at first. Its binding was sticky. The pages were stuck together. In some places, the paper was as hard as leather. When it was opened, the smell was so pungent that the person describing it felt nauseous. He noted this in the catalogue and requested a sealed box. So the notebook ended up in a closed collection. Access to the collection was restricted under the pretext of the fragility of the materials. In reality, several employees who read the recordings began complaining of identical dreams. They saw stone corridors and pupilless yellow eyes. They woke up with the feeling of warm breath on their faces. In the mid-20th century, one of the archivists made an attempt to systematize these materials. He copied several pages of the notebook by hand so as not to disturb the original. His copy retained descriptions of the creature's anatomy and the pack's behavior. There was also mention of a lead plate and strange punctures on the official's neck. A week after completing his work, the archivist died of an unexplained infection. Inflamed, musky-smelling patches were discovered on his skin. Doctors diagnosed him with a rare condition. His colleagues stopped asking questions, so the documents faded into obscurity once again. They lay in drawers that were rarely opened. A silence grew around them, like the silence of a tomb. The catalogue retained neutral names: heat damage, disease damage, tunnel collapse. But the copies that could not be destroyed continued to exist. They passed from hand to hand like a forbidden relic that no one wants to keep for long. And yet, the plateau site continued to operate according to its own rules. In recent years, archaeologists have been attempting to obtain permission for new excavations. Official responses cited the preservation of the monuments. Unofficially, they cited unstable soil. At night, even security guards were not allowed in, limiting themselves to observation from a distance. Cameras sometimes captured strange holes in the sand that appeared and disappeared without any wind. Thermal measurements showed a brief increase in temperature, as if a large body were passing under the sand. The most alarming thing was that these phenomena intensified after rains, rare for the desert. The water seeped into the ground. Then the surface began to subside slightly, as if cavities were opening up underneath. Experts attributed this to natural processes, but the local guides left this area before the measurements began. Their steps quickened, their faces were covered with cloth, their eyes avoided looking at the sand. The engineer officer's notebook ultimately survived precisely because they were afraid to destroy it. Whoever ordered the records concealed understood that the paper would be the only warning. Within the lines lay a cold calculation. The creature was described as a biological species. It wasn't a myth. It was a predator, adapted to stone, darkness, and waiting. It could slow down, wait out its hunger, and then awaken when prey appeared. Its pack operated without unnecessary noise. Their hunting was a discipline of nature. If these records ever fall into the hands of someone who decides to repeat the excavations, they'll think they understand the risk. They'll bring more soldiers. He'll take more weapons. He'll take more light. But the notebook has already shown that guns aren't the answer when the enemy is built for tight corridors. She showed that sealing the entrance doesn't always mean victory. She showed that disappearances continued even after the stone slabs and lead had been removed. The plateau stands in the sun, as it has for centuries. Tourists look at the pyramids and don't see the patch of sand where the earth sometimes breathes. The guards stare at the monitors, baffled by the seemingly inexplicable sand settling. The archives hold dry reports and remain silent about the deleted pages. But beneath the sand remains something that once awoke and remembered its taste. And if someone strikes the stone with a crowbar again, the darkness below will become warmer. The scent of musk will rise into the air. The sand will tremble. And in the depths, where the stone corridors are too narrow for escape, the hunt will begin again, leaving no witnesses.